this is my talk. Empathy, what it is, what it isn't, and why it matters. That's a bad place for that. So I want to start with a little story. My very first office job was in the mid-1990s, right at the start of Web 1.0. And I had a boss who made me cry, occasionally by throwing things near my head. His bosses, sort of my boss's bosses, the head honchos of our department, were two women, marketing executives. And they hauled me into a conference room one day when they caught me crying and told me that under no circumstances was I ever to cry at work. Maybe you've heard something like this yourself. Depending on how old you are, you may have experienced it yourself, or you've at least heard it existed, or still exists. For many years, workplaces were about work. You left your personal problems at the door, and in the times when you accidentally brought them with you, preferably it was at a company party where everyone was too drunk to remember. But the office was no place for emotions or for deep human connection. A lot of workplaces are still like that, right? Not everyone works in a creative field or at a startup or in a culture where there are a lot of norms around openly expressing your feelings or giving hugs in the office, consensual hugs only. Even so, over the past few years, there's been an increase in people talking about feelings at work, but the word they use is empathy, and they use it a lot. I started seeing the word empathy so much thrown around in all sorts of contexts that earlier this year I decided to finally start writing about it. And at one point I said that at its core, empathy is about feelings. So a bunch of people wrote me and they said, empathy is not feelings. And I said, I know it's not feelings. And they said, it's a skill. And I said, I agree, it's a skill, but it's a skill that does involve feelings. At its most basic, empathy can be defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, or even the psychological identification with another's feelings or perspective. But empathy is actually more complicated than that. Did you know there are two kinds of empathy? Emotional and affective, and cognitive. So emotional and affective, feeling someone else's feels, getting into their emotional state, putting yourself in their shoes. And then there's the putting yourself in someone else's shoes from a perspective shift. Understanding their motivations, their intentions, their beliefs. These are different kinds of empathy that we like to lump together. They don't always inform one another, but they can, and they are equally, if differently, at times important. Not everyone is able to do them equally, but for most of us, we can learn to better do at least one of them, if not both. We naturally empathize, as you may have heard in a really great talk yesterday, with people most similar to us. Feeling their feelings isn't a stretch, and it doesn't produce the kinds of terrible anxiety, just like that horrible chest-gutting feeling of hearing someone else's feelings and really experiencing them when they've experienced something terrible that you can't fathom a human experiencing. Or when you experience a lot of guilt and anxiety that you are somehow responsible for this. And with similar people, our perspectives have been shaped by similar life experiences, cultural influences, institutional structures, and social norms. So our empathetic leaps, either emotional or cognitive, aren't that big. This is why empathy, both kinds of empathy, are so important. Because as difficult as it may be, over time we can use them to better understand people who are different from us. And as we begin to better understand people who are different from us, we recognize patterns in behavior. I bet you didn't think a sociologist would be excited about patterns. Surprise. Those patterns and feelings, behavior, perspective, beliefs, and more are super critical because when you see patterns, you can do work that is broadly, even globally beneficial and resonant while still allowing individuals to feel heard. And I don't think that I need to convince you of the value of that, whether you're a maker or you're doing social justice, whatever it is, that's incredible. The problem is that empathy has morphed into kind of this buzzword. You hear it everywhere, right? And I think it's like this catch-all for this collective desire to give a shit and be better people, which is a great impulse, applaud. But I don't think that empathy is just about giving a shit and giving a shit in situations where you do better. Because that's not actually what empathy is or how it works. And when we think about empathy like this, we run around and we wield it like a hammer where every problem is a nail. Empathy is valuable in lots of situations, but it's not the only tool and it's not the only part of our process. we sometimes say empathy when we mean sympathy, and sympathy is not a negative. I know sympathy is like you just think of cards where someone has died. That is not what sympathy is inherently about. And sympathy isn't a bad thing, it's a great thing. Empathy isn't kindness, it isn't compassion, it isn't acting, it isn't doing something other than understanding and gaining that perspective. Empathy is really valuable when someone else is so different from us that in order to really engage in a compassionate act, we don't understand them, we don't get it, so we're not as compelled, we don't know how to do it, we don't know how to make that compassionate act really valuable. But when we assess someone else's perspective, we can assess their emotional state, and we start to understand it, we work out of something new, not our own assumptions and biases. And careful use of empathy can be really powerful, especially because the more careful you are with empathy, the less likely you're going to engage in emotional empathy that isn't healthy and that burns you out, which is a real thing, and we're going to get to it. So let's step back and start thinking about when and how empathy is valuable and what we can do with it. I'll give you an example. When I was doing my dissertation, I did an 18-month ethnography of doctors in the United States as they transitioned in small clinics that were connected by a larger organization, as they transitioned from paper records to electronic health records. And I sat in a lot of medical offices, and I watched a lot of communication with medical assistants and doctors, and I interviewed a lot of people. And after a while, the doctors began to announce, half jokingly, whenever I'd walk in, "It's the office therapist." And they'd be super excited to see me. And I would sit down with them and I would talk to them and understand their beliefs, their opinions, the ways in which they work, what work meant to them, all of these different things, how they communicate with people, patients, organizations, healthcare more generally. And as you may know, thanks in part to Shah, but probably because you're all very aware, and some of you live in the United States healthcare system has some problems. It's not the best. And there's a lot of opinions about doctors. But by doing this kind of research, I was able to, and look, my mom is a doctor, so I have a lot of opinions about doctors. But I was able to step out of my biases and my preconceived notions and my assumptions. And best of all, when there were a lot of problems that came up during the transition and the implementation of the electronic health records, I was able to understand that the motivations for those problems were deeper than what people saw on the surface. And they were individual, they were group-based, there was a lot more going on. And as one doctor said to me, "Of course I like talking to you. It's nice to talk to someone who actually listens to me." So when you hear someone feel that way, and you give them the chance to be heard, you have a better opportunity to dig down into the root of the problem, rather than hack away at a problem that's manifested itself as a branch. And the more root systems you investigate, the more you see how even though each root system might produce a different type of tree, they're still trees. There's still similarities in those trees, and those similarities are worth investigating. It happens in ethnography, it happens at my job in user research, and it also happens in the advice column I write. Although I don't think advice column is a great name for what I do, I like to think of myself as a perspective counselor. And I wrote that before Trish's talk, so I want you to know we are basically synthesizing all the time, be terrified. I don't hand down edicts, but instead I talk people through their problems, and I get to some of the deeper themes beneath what they tell me is wrong. Now, I have heard from friends, coworkers, strangers, a lot of people, readers write me and say thank you, and they seem to think that, they tell me I seem so empathetic and intuitive. And that's the sense I get is they think that I'm I have this special natural ability. And look, if you would like to think that I am a wizard who can magically divine and somehow communicate the deep secrets of the human condition, please continue thinking that. Thanks. Also tweet about it. That would be great. But I may have a greater affinity for thinking about and talking about feelings. I may be more oriented toward empathy in the way that some people are really good at running. I am not. Some people are really interested in visual design and are skilled at it. But the thing about empathy is it is a skill, just like anything else, and you can learn to get better at it. I think what I'm doing and what surprises people is kind of creating a pattern language of human experience and emotions. You can learn that language. Even if you never become fluent in it, you can pick up some of the basics, and it's hugely powerful. So it is important to remember this very, very specific fact. Empathizing is not the same thing as solving someone's problem, or any problem, unless the problem is they don't feel like they're being heard, but that's a little bit different. It is developing a deeper understanding. But how you act on that understanding, that's a whole separate act. Researchers at the University of Michigan who look specifically at suffering at work and compassion at work find that empathetic understanding is a necessary aspect of this compassion. But don't mistake empathy for a willingness to act or for kindness. They're different. Sympathy, again, that's seeing someone in distress or in need and being in a position to focus on and even help them. And I think we sometimes in the products we create, we're sympathetic, right? Because we're like, oh, you have a need, I want to fix that. That's not empathy. It's great, but it's not empathy. One of our core values at Slack is empathy. So I have a pretty good front seat into how a company is engaging with empathy and what they're doing. And the thing I found is that pretty much everyone I've worked with, I wouldn't say there's anyone I've worked with who isn't this way, they're genuinely interested in users' perspectives and their feelings about things, even when they're really uncomfortable. I haul people into usability and user research sessions all the time. And I tell them they have to sit on their hands if they think they want to tell a user what to do. They really are interested in it. The more they do it, the more they want to do it in general. They want to do it sooner. They want to do it at different parts of the product because they're really understanding, oh, when you do this, your perspective is totally different. You're not baked into this set of biases. And what's really fun, though, is not just when they sit on those sessions and tell me my job is really cool, which is fun, I'll be honest, but it's when they take that understanding and they do something with it. They empathize with engineers whose code, who will have to deal with the code that they're writing. They, in a welcome screen, they have a little brown hand rather than just a white hand that you always see. They take a feature that users have specifically requested, and they're willing to say, what if what you requested isn't the right solution, but our understanding of your problem can guide us to it? I saw this recently working on a hotly contested feature that I will not tell you about specifically, but one day you'll find out. But the fun thing about it was that it was a specific user request, and it had fiercely divided a lot of people in the company, right? So there were strongly held opinions at every level of the company about this feature. So I went and I did a bunch of research, hauled along engineers and product managers and designers and writers and everyone I could get my hands on. And then I came back and I presented what we found as a team. And I respected the users' feelings and their, what they were telling us and what their experience was, but I also tried to really be empathetic to the people who had built this feature because they had put in about, long time into this feature. And I didn't want to say, congratulations, you built a piece of shit. And what happened was the feature pivoted, but it pivoted in a way where it was like, great, we can start to address different types of problems, not cram them all into one feature. And it was really cool to watch. And the thing about that is really great is that puts empathy as everyone's responsible for it. It's not just one person. Because let's get real, one person cannot be responsible for all the empathy. In particular, too much empathy, emotional empathy, isn't healthy. In 2014, psychologist and cognitive scientist Paul Bloom published a piece called Against Empathy. And you may bristle at that title, I definitely did. He's not against empathy, but empathy as a cure-all, that catch-all buzzword. Empathy isn't enough on its own, and also emotional empathy can be really damaging. Because it's such a buzzword, we don't think about this. But you have to think of the negatives of emotional empathy. When people are just connecting too much, when they're burnt out, when you just feel like, oh, just make it stop. That happens to specific people. And it can be really difficult. It can be unpaid labor, people can get frustrated. It's a real thing. And we need to remember that not everyone empathizes with the empath, and also they're sort of left to clean up the shit. And that's really hard. So we have to understand it better to take care of the people who are empathizing. Another problem with empathy as buzzword is people love to measure empathy. They want to bottle it and sell it and put it in headlines. So they created the empathy quotient, which you may have heard about. This is kind of what got me to write about it. And if it's not clear, I don't think empathy is something you can turn into a metric. I understand the desire to measure, but I think what you're trying to measure is how much do we do with empathy? What kinds of compassionate acts do we do? What kinds of business decisions if we start thinking about our colleagues and the people that we design products for? Belinda Parmar, the CEO of the company that created the empathy quotient, said that empathy is a hard skill, and there's nothing soft about it, which I hope you're all laughing, because never in your lives have you heard anyone say that something to do with feelings is a hard skill, because if it were, trust me, Silicon Valley would pay people who do empathetic work as much as they pay engineers. And engineers are doing empathetic work, but you know what I'm talking about. But I think I should be generous, which is that Parmar is kind of doing what those execs did for me 20 years ago. She's saying, I need to give you some tools. Don't cry at the office. You're in a terrible situation. You have to make nice with this person. You have to do something to succeed in an environment in which norms haven't shifted yet. And what does business respond best to? Numbers, and you're going to make more money. So let's find a way to speak that language. So if we're going to introduce empathy into the workplace, we shouldn't just toss it in, because you can't expect a skill oriented around feelings to thrive in an environment in which they've never been welcome. Empathy isn't always a big, huge, life-changing event, and it isn't always uncomfortable, but it's super important, and this is the real secret. Learning to be truly emotionally empathetic opens you up to a deeper understanding about other people, the world, and yourself, and you stop acting like you're the expert on everything, because you're not. And you're definitely not the expert on other people's experiences and their perceptions and feelings. And if you learn that, and also about other people, you're able to build products, to do things in the world that resonate in a different way. I just want to say, if you're kind of curious how you would want to do this, do a feedback session with someone you work with that you've always had a struggle with. Or do a feedback session with a user. Sit and listen, but the thing you have to do is you have to listen. You can't tell them it's going to be okay. You can't try to fix the problem right then. You can't try to get them to make you feel better in that moment about the problem that they're experiencing. You have to listen and understand, and then you have to take that understanding and you have to do something with it. Otherwise, you've wasted everyone's time. Feelings are okay. They're good. It is hard to be a whole person at work, to bring yourself to the place where you spend roughly a third of your life. Yes, and that just fell. But this is encouraged of us more and more, right? We're expected not just to do our jobs, but to come and bring our whole selves to work, to be emotionally and cognitively invested in everything that we do in all the moments of our days in environments that have never valued that. So don't downplay empathy by stripping it of its power, which are emotions. Emotions and higher level thinking are kind of what make us cool as humans. Part of it anyway. So don't let business wreck the hell out of this really human skill by kind of turning it into an anemic buzzword that you can measure, that you can have catchy reports and headlines. If we really want empathy, we have to create workplaces where it's safe to have feelings. And sometimes that might even mean tears. Thank you.